Okay, so I'll start then.
Right.
A very good evening to everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank the organizers of Victorian Sundays for giving this platform to me and inviting me. Before I start, I should mention that I do not have any formal background in Victorian studies. I come from a background of nutritional sciences and biological sciences. Uh, However, I've been following the Victorian Sundays podcast since its very first episode, and I really like the concept. And when I saw that the specialization is open, I thought, why not do a case study on Victorian England using the framework or model that we have in public health nutrition to understand the health and nutrition status of that particular time period of that society. So I got some interesting observations that I'll be sharing with you all today. So let me share my screen.
Yes. Before you begin, I want to thank you for doing this because we have got culinary studies, but this for the first time, I guess that Victorian studies will be looked at from the angle of nutrition. So all the best.
Yeah, thank you.
Definitely know that this is going to be a very interesting lecture. Thank you, Shona.
Yes.
The stage is all yours.
Uh, is my slide visible full
Yeah, it,
screen?
it is visible. Yes, it is visible.
Yes. Let me set the context with a brief note on food, nutrition, and Victorian England. So, food shapes and is shaped by culture, what we eat, how we prepare it, and with whom we share it are deeply embedded in the historical and cultural fabric of the society. Recipes are often passed down through generations, acting as tangible links to the past. Meal times, dining etiquette, and domestic rituals are shaped by social expectations, and they reveal much about gender roles, moral values, and collective identities. From a public health point of view, two major concepts that help us understand how we experience food are food security and nutrition security. Food security has four fundamental pillars: food availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability. It has multiple determinants, which include physical conditions, social factors, economic factors, political stability, and technological advancements. However, food security may not always ensure nutrition security, which goes one step further to ensure dietary quality and nutritional adequacy. So, in this context, the story of dietary transitions in Victorian England raises critical questions about the impact of shifting demographics, rapid urbanization, industrialization, and evolving public health priorities on the food system and nutritional outcomes of the time. The journey begins with widespread food insecurity in the early Victorian period, progressing towards significantly improved food availability, accessibility, affordability by the late Victorian era, though this progress was accompanied by a contested and uneven state of nutrition security. So, before going into further details, I'd like to highlight some dominant narratives that we have on Victorian diets. So, it is generally believed that the Victorians, particularly the mid-Victorians, ate an inadequate diet that contributed to increased morbidity and mortality, and the nutritional value of particularly the working class diet was inferior, unsuitable, degraded. These are the terms that we can generally see, which contributed to malnutrition, infections, and death. Definitely, there were infections, but whether or not it's due to nutritional causes, that we'll be exploring today. And finally, an improvement in dietary intake was observed between 1877 to 1889, owing to import of cheaper basic foods. So these are the dominant narratives that we have, but whether or not it's correct, that I mean, it's not clear yet. However, I tried to explore the reasons behind it, and to understand what are the factors that contributed to food security by the end of the era, and whether it was uh, able to ensure nutrition security among the Victorians or not. So the story begins again with the Corn Laws. So after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in Britain, there was a prediction that there will be a drop in food prices because the market will be open. There will be more free trades happening between the European countries. So there was a prediction that the food price will fall. So in response to that, the landowners, they pressurized the parliament to take action, which led to the formation of these corn laws. So corn here doesn't mean just corn, it's basically grains, any grain including wheat, barley, oat, whichever they were using. So these laws imposed very high tariffs on foreign imported cereals and other goods, including cotton, making foreign grains significantly more expensive. So grains were highly expensive even when the public, the people, they were not able to buy grains. And as a result of importing grain become costly and impractical, even during times of domestic grain was scarce. So these corn laws were basically introduced by the parliament to safeguard the financial health of the landowners, but actually it was very difficult for the people to buy and eat the grains, and therefore a lot of protest happened. And in fact there was a anti-corn law group who were continuously asking for the repeal of the corn laws. So eventually what happened, it was very unfortunate, in 1840s, that time, the hungry forties, popularly known as. So there was an Irish potato crop failure in 1845, particularly, which resulted in mass starvation and economic depression, widely known as the Hungry Forties. This forced Sir Robert Peel, who introduced these corn laws, and his conservative government to reconsider the corn laws. And eventually, in 1846, the corn laws were repealed. Why? Because it was not in the favor of the public, and there was huge starvation and related problems because of these corn laws. So after these corn laws were repealed, the food price again fell down, and it signaled the beginning of affordable food age. And by 1850, the starting of the mid-Victorian period, the quality and quantity of the working class diet improved markedly. And by 1861, an improvement in adult life expectancy was observed. Since the economy became free, people could buy and afford all sorts of food items, which led to a better dietary diversity of the mid Victorians. They could buy, they could afford a wide variety of food items. And also, there was expansion of railway communication, which made fresh produce available at the urban spaces. Nutritional status of the working class people were good if we compare them with the late Victorian period people. The mid Victorian period people had a better nutritional status, and their working capacity was much high. For example, workers could routinely shovel up 20 tons of earth per day from below their feet to above their heads, which definitely requires enormous physical activity and energy throughput. However, there were problems with of infections, especially among infants and newborn. So, if we look at the infant mortality, newborn mortality rates, it was quite high at that point of time. So, life expectancy at birth was relatively lower. However, by the age of 5 years, all these problems like infections, those who could survive, and after that, like after 5 years of age, if we calculate their life expectancy, it was similar to modern times. So life expectancy at age 5, life expectancy at age 20, these were much better. But yes, life expectancy at birth was low, which can be attributed to high rates of infections among infants because vaccination was not so common, and there were problems with sanitation, hygiene, and many other things. So the public health professionals, what they do, they generally take 1900 as the starting point for calculating and projecting different public health indicators statistics, and therefore they feel like, okay, we have made lot of progress from the uh, Victorian period. But if we take previous years like mid-Victorian time period at starting point, we can see that the later Victorian period, there was actually a drop in life expectancy. However, infant mortality rates and all these things improved because and also maternal mortality rates improved towards the end of the century, which can be again attributed to better healthcare facilities that were being available at that time. So let's look at the energy consumption of mid-Victorians. So like right now, if we see, we consume around 1,800 to 2,000 calories on an average day. Um, but the energy consumption of the mid-Victorians were around 1.5 to 2 times higher than what we do currently. So for men, it was like around 3,000 to 4,500 kilocalories per day. And for women, it was around 2,400 to 3,500 calories per day. Uh, People who are involved in navy or military work, uh, for them the intake was much higher, like more than 5,000, which was again appropriate at that point of time for that particular group. So the Victorians, they were involved in moderate to heavy physical activity, and additional energy they had to expend every day for traveling to their workspaces, their work. So Victorian, mid-Victorian societies were primarily like rural societies, and work opportunities were more in the urban centers, and they had to travel on feet, and therefore energy expenditure was much high because they were in the moderate to heavy physical activity group, not like the current people who are in the sedentary activity group. And also they had to spend a lot of energy for their household work, which included cooking, gardening, and all other activities. And yes, those who are involved in heavy physical activity, they required more than 5,000 kilocalories per day. So it indicates that even after consuming this high amounts of calories, there was not very high prevalence of obesity, overweight, or non-communicable diseases like that we have today. Why? Because they were able to use this much energy. And this indicates a high level of energy metabolism, a healthy energy metabolism among the mid Victorian adults. Let's look at the dietary diversity of mid Victorians, what they actually ate. So, they used to have different food groups in their diet, like cereals, legumes, roots and tubers, vegetables, fruits, meat, fish, poultry, dairy, nuts and seeds, fats and oils, and so on. Their diet was primarily seasonal because storage facilities were not available, and they used to replace food items based on the season. For example, onions, which were very cheap, particularly in summers. However, in winters, onions were not much available, so they had to replace onions with leeks. And this way, they also had a very high consumption of meat, bread. So, bread, meat, these were like their staple food. And at that point of time, food security and well-being of the people, their state of hunger, were calculated based on how whether they can afford bread and meat. Because other things were much cheap, these are the things which were relatively costly, and therefore the administrators, the government used to consider the prices of only these particular food products like meat and bread. And these are some common recipes from the Victorian kitchen. So on day-to-day basis, they used to have sandwiches, porridges, puddings, broths. Broths were very common. Meat broths, vegetable broths, and then fruit broths, and so on. Steak and organ meats, prawns, fish fillets, gravies, fruit gravies, oyster sauce, cakes and pies. These are some common recipes from their kitchen. Now, let's look at the demographic transition, like the factors behind this kind of particular dietary patterns that they were having. So, as I said before, you can observe in these plots, in the x-axis we have the years here, and in the y-axis we have the rates. So, before 1850, more than 50% of the population were staying in rural regions. However, as time was progressing, rural people were migrating to urban spaces, which can be again attributed to industrialization, urbanization. So, the share of rural people in the total population decrease, and share of urban people of the out of the total population increase over time. Also, there was an increase in the natural growth of both rural and urban spaces. However, in urban spaces, natural growth rate was higher than the rural spaces. Birth rates were fluctuating, and again, here we can see the net rates of rural and urban migration. So, from rural to urban spaces, there were very high levels of migration, but from urban to rural spaces, migrations were limited. So these demographic transitions had significant impact on the dietary intake of the Victorians. So the poor laboring communities in the remote rural parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, they were mostly, found to have nutritious diets in Britain. And these areas also recorded very low rates of mortality because they were following a peasant style traditional lifestyle in the rural parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland. And their culture centered around plentiful, locally produced, inexpensive food items like potatoes, vegetables, whole grains, milk, fish. But as they were moving to the urban spaces, these fresh produces, the uh, proportion of fresh produces in their diet were reducing because of urbanization, and things were not available in the urban spaces. And by the time they used to get it from rural to urban spaces, there used to be significant loss of nutrient levels in those food items. For example, vitamin C content used to reduce significantly when they used to transport the fresh produce from the rural to urban spaces. And this shift negatively affected many poor in the later half of the 19th century. And at the same time, urbanization with its expanding transport networks improved access to a wide variety of food. So, with urbanization, slowly packaged food products, processed food products, convenience food products were being more available in the urban areas than the rural areas, because people had very less time to cook food in the urban spaces because of their work commitments. So they were preferring such kind of convenience food items. Let's look at the health and disease status. So, as I just mentioned, that when infant mortality is stripped out by the age of 5, almost the life expectancy at age 5 was similar to us. It was for around 75 for men and around 73 for women. So, for women, life expectancy was lower, which can be again attributed to non-nutritional or non-health related causes. For example, accidents like burns were very common among women of that time period, because of their certain dressing styles and the way they used to do their work in the kitchen. Burns were very common. So also there was problem with maternal mortality. So while giving birth and later on, they used to face lot of problems, and that's why um, the life expectancy of women was lower than men. However, later on in the modern time periods or in the post-Victorian time periods, uh, for women, life expectancy was more than 80 years, and it was much higher than the men, which was solely due to improved maternal healthcare services and women health services that were being available. Certain infections were very common, for example, tuberculosis and other lung infections like pneumonia. And there used to be epidemics of smallpox, influenza, scarlet fever, and sexually transmitted diseases were also common. Accidents and trauma, those were linked to workplace and domestic conditions, for example, burn, I mentioned in case of women. And infant and maternal mortality was again due to infections. Heart failure cases were there, but that was not due to nutritional causes or diet related causes. It was primarily due to rheumatic fever, which is basically a streptococcal infection. But non communicable diseases were not common. Cancer cases used to be there in mid Victorian time period, but it was very rare. And other non communicable diseases were also rare, especially the diet related non communicable diseases that we have. So it again indicates that the dietary intake of these mid Victorians were pretty good, and at least much better than what the late Victorians and post Victorians were eating. And the lower prevalence and incidence of diet related non communicable diseases reinforces that factor. Let's look at water, sanitation, and hygiene, wash status. So, in Victorian period, the public used to be very worried about sanitation and hygiene related things. They used to initially in the early Victorian period, they used to rely on water which was drawn from ponds and rivers, not filtered water. It was from ponds and rivers, which they transported to their home using buckets, and they used to dispose human waste on streets and neighboring areas of their house. So there was no proper sanitation and hygiene management system available. Particularly the elites, they considered working class people as they perceived them as unhygienic, ignorant, apathetic, and also they were termed known as the great unwashed. The working class people, the elites, they used to call the working class people as the great unwashed because of their perception. However, by the end of the century, piped water became available, which was sourced from wells and lakes. And mostly it was available in the urban areas, not much in the rural areas. Likewise, the sewage management system was being developed, and in fact, in England, in many spaces, those sewage management systems of that time can still be visible, and some of them are still operating. So it indicates that the system was quite strong, and the engineering system was also properly planned. The success of these reforms definitely reflected in the pattern of infectious diseases. So before they had this sewage management system, there was a very high prevalence of enteric diseases and infections like typhoid, cholera, typhus, gastroenteritis, and also smallpox, tuberculosis, which are associated with poor hygiene and then crowding, these kind of factors. These things were contributing to the lower life expectancy of the previous period. However, with improved sewage management system, especially during the mid-Victorian time period, ruled out these infectious diseases. And by 1890s, the mortality had fallen dramatically due to mortality due to enteric infections. Of all the infectious diseases, cholera was the greatest fear of the Victorians. They used to call it the king cholera. And there were recurring epidemics of cholera like in 1832, 1849, 1855, 1866. And it was greatly influenced by the social, political, and health policy reforms in the Victorian England. So they had a huge scare about cholera, other than like any other disease. And this ultimately led to the formation and passing of this Public Health Act of 1848. It was passed by Edwin Chadwick, and he considered that the most important steps to improve the health of the public were to improve the drainage and provision of sewers, the removal of all refuse from houses, streets, and roads, the provision of clean drinking water, and appointment of a medical officer for each town. So the recurring cholera epidemics that they were having, that ultimately led to the formation of this particular Public Health Act, which in turn improved the sewage management, waste management system, and drinking water quality, potable water availability in Victorian England after 1848. So we have discussed about diet, we have discussed about water. So now let's discuss about alcohol consumption and tobacco. So among the working class people, if I talk about, beer was the most commonly consumed alcohol. However, the alcohol content of the percentage of alcohol in the beers used to be lower than the modern times. It was around 1 to 3% alcohol, whereas now we have around 5% alcohol. Wine was not common for the working class people. However, it was quite common among the elites. At least one third of the households either drank alcohol very moderately or didn't drink it at all, because they used to have this temperance movement where they were trying to limit the alcohol consumption or completely stop alcohol consumption at that point of time, because so many social problems were coming up, which were directly related to alcohol consumption in that period. So this anti-alcohol movement that particularly encouraged people to reduce or avoid alcohol consumption for moral, health, or social reasons. There was a Sale of Beer Act 1854, which restricted the Sunday opening hours. Sunday is the Lord's Day, so They stopped selling of beer and other alcohols on Sunday evenings. However, it was repealed in 1855 because everybody wanted to drink alcohol on Sunday evenings. And pipe smoking was very common. However, it was more common among working class men. It was not so common among women until 1920s. Another big issue in Victorian England was food adulteration. Initially, they didn't have any guideline, any legislation which could limit food adulteration. However, with growing availability of packaged food items, there was a felt, need of a proper act. So, food adulteration significantly undermined their quality of life, particularly in the overcrowded, poorly supplied, and loosely regulated industrial towns. And ultimately, Pure Food Act was passed in 1860. And by 1900, while most staple foods met legal standards of purity, the use of chemicals were permitted. So they had this act which limited food adulteration in commonly consumed food items. However, many chemical additives were still allowed to be used. So, definition wise, these food items were pure, were free of any kind of harmful ingredient. However, actually, if we analyze them, they used to have lot of adulterants, many of which were harmful to the health. For example, some common adulterants I've listed here. In bread, they used to add alum. Alum is not that bad for health, but definitely it's an adulterant. Water and chalk in milk, sulfate of iron in tea, sulfate of copper in pickles, bottled fruit, wine, preserves, lead chromate in mustard, mercury and arsenic compounds as colorants in confectionery, and picrotoxin in beer. So picrotoxin, it's basically it increases the uh, potency of the beer. I mean, it makes it more intoxicating. So it's a toxin basically. So and people were aware of these adulterants. It's not like they were unaware of it. People were aware, and that's why they used to have lot of fear regarding food adulteration, food safety, food hygiene, which was also targeted by the advertising industries. I'll discuss that. um, so now let's look at the dietary quality of the late Victorians. So I started with the early Victorians who faced food insecurity due to the corn laws and then the hungry forties. Then, after the repealing of the corn laws, there was increased availability and affordability of food items in the mid-Victorian era, and their dietary intake was optimal if we look at them from today's standards. However, in the late Victorian period, there was a decline in dietary quality. So industrial revolution made possible the mass production of a wide variety of different food products. Food costs reduced due to import of cheaper basics like cereals and meat, and because of their very strong naval communication, they were importing wheat products and new wheat milling technologies from America. Tinned meat products arrived from Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and canned fruits and milk became widely available. So we can see a rise in convenience food items like processed food items, packaged food items in the late Victorian period. And sugar became inexpensive, too cheap. And industrial cigarette production started at this point of time, particularly after 1880s. So sugar, which is basically empty calories, nothing but calories, became the staple of the new industrial proletariat, the working class people. They used to depend on sugar. However, so if we now look at this situation from food security aspect, we can see that okay, they can afford basic food items, they can access different types of food items, but whether those food items are nutritionally proper or not, that is a big question again. So food security, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, doesn't always ensure nutrition security. And uh, the impact of such kind of a situation where we have food security but very low nutrition security can be seen in the health status of that population. So here are some Victorian marketing and advertisements. So printing techniques improved significantly at late Victorian period, and with that, advertising industry also flourished. So there was no ban on alcohol advertisement, cigarette advertisement. There was no ban, and you can see here in this particular advertisement from 1893, they're focusing on. So this is an advertise for a cake. Okay, so they are focusing on this particular ingredients, butter sugar, made from pure butter sugar. So this indicates that the people of that time, they used to prefer butter and sugar, and they used to consider it as something, important, healthy, which can meet their nutritional requirements. And in fact, in many cases, we can see that they have a common saying that if it's a happy household, there will be always the smell of butter, bread, and sugar coming. So they used to prefer butter, sugar, and products which are rich in fat and such kind of empty calories. And also, we can see another label claim here, made entirely by machinery, untouched by hand. So, as I said, the late Victorians, they were aware of adulterants, they were aware of food safety issues, hygiene related issues. So, the food companies, they were targeting that particular aspect. So, they were saying that, okay, buy our processed canned food, packaged food, which is not touched by humans at all, and it's totally safe, hygienic, and it has lot of butter in it, lot of sugar in it. So this is how they introduce sugar and butter in their daily life, in their daily diet. And the effects were visible definitely um, in the health status of the late Victorians and also in the post Victorian era. And also we can see here is another advertise of packaged meat products from 1904. So Victorian cigarette advertisements used to be very simple, and after 1920s they started showing women smoking. Before that, it was not a good girls thing before 1920, but from 1920 onwards, women started appearing in cigarette advertisements. So let's look at the impact of these inferior quality late Victorian diets on their health and nutrition status. So towards the end of 19th century, around 50% of young working class recruits in the military were malnourished. This was not a problem at the beginning of the century, where working class people, working class youth were mostly nourished. But towards the end of the century, 50% of the youth working class were malnourished. And they had to reduce the height cutoff for military recruitment from 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet. in the late Victorian period. So this indicates that population stunting was a common problem. So stunting basically means low height for age, and it's an indicator of chronic undernutrition. And we have this kind of situation, chronic undernutrition, when we have an intergenerational malnutrition. So the parents are malnourished, the children will be also be malnourished, and later on they'll have such problems of stunting, chronic undernutrition, where the height is not increasing. Because of the introduction of too much sugary products, dental diseases, dental caries peaked, and they were having problems with chewing, swallowing, these kind of things. And non-communicable diseases started to rise thereafter. So in the mid-Victorian time period, we saw that non-communicable diseases were very rare. But as these products were introduced in the late Victorian period, the prevalence and incidence of non-communicable diseases started rising, and we are still having a same situation. I mean, it's still increasing, and we can't forget, sugar and butter and fat from our daily life. It's still a major part of our diet. And even in India, with increased westernization, we have same sort of problems. Let's look at the diet of the elites and the table etiquettes that they used to focus on briefly. So, elite diets were marked by abundance, refinement, and variety. They used to have, 7 course, 11 course, 15 course dinners, and very grand dinner parties. Common dishes were like roasted meats, exotic fruits, imported delicacies, pastries, puddings, wine, and so on. There was a great French influence. French terminologies were increasingly being used in British food. And they also, got many chefs from France for their kitchens, the elites. And also, they used to have very highly formalized dinner etiquette. Everything was calculated. There were very strict rules like correct placement of the cutleries and glasses, waiting for the host to begin eating, conversing with only those who are sitting beside, and not reaching across the table or seasoning food unasked. So, they used to focus highly on these table etiquette things and how one looks while eating. But the realities of the working class were totally different. Their focus on getting as much food as possible and not how one looks while eating. So let's look at the diets that they were having in the workhouses. So there was the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834, which kept the workhouse diets intentionally inferior to even those who are, laboring poor. So workhouse diets were very inferior, and the staple foods were like bread, gruel, porridge. So it was carbohydrate rich, very low in protein, very low in micronutrients. You can see a whole day menu from 6 different workhouses. It mostly has bread, cheese, gruel. Gruel is nothing but cereal mix, and occasionally meat and potatoes, and very rarely fruits. Fruits were never actually included. Vegetables occasionally they used to have. Inmates displaying refractory behavior could have their rations further restricted at the discretion of the boards of guardians. So if somebody is not behaving accordingly, they could stop their ration. And also there were some scandals, like some inmates were discovered gnawing on decayed animal bones, which highlights the extreme deprivation within the system. And it eventually led to so many reforms in the poor law, which finally little bit improved the condition, standardized the rations of the workhouses, And by 1890s, the workhouses were primarily occupied by the elderly and chronically ill people. So public complaints about the workhouse conditions continued to mount on. So we can see a lot of literary portrayals also of this workhouse diets. For example, in Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, where Oliver asked for another serving of gruel, which indicates that the serving sizes were not standardized, and the quantity of food being served was really low, and hunger was a daily phenomenon. Let's look at the diets in prison. So, in Victorian England, during Victorian period, it was the first time they conducted a systematic dietary survey in prisons to understand prisoners' food intakes and which kind of rations they were getting. So the diets varied by the sentence length. Shorter terms had nutritionally poorer diets, again bread and gruel. In 1840, prisoners suffered from scurvy. Scurvy is like bleeding gums, which is due to vitamin C deficiency. And civilians didn't have that problem, so they compared the food intake, dietary intake of the prisoners with that of the civilians, and they found that the prisoners, they were not getting enough potatoes in their diet. So they confirmed that potatoes is a cost-effective anti-scorbutic agent, anti-scorbutic food. And even after boiling, the vitamin C content can be preserved in potato because of the particular structure the potato has. The vitamin C content can be preserved a little bit longer. So inadequate prison diets also led to huge weight loss among the prisoners over time, especially those who used to get long sentences. And they also found in Scottish prison studies that milk was found to improve, nutritional status, and therefore milk was gradually introduced in their diet. There were controversies, like the humanitarians, they advocated sufficient diets for the prisoners for rehabilitation, while the administrators, they insisted the prison diets must be inferior to that of the honest poor. Similar thing we can also observe in the workhouses. So the idea behind keeping workhouse diets inferior is that so that nobody willfully goes there and takes shelter. So that's the reason they were keeping the quality of the diet inferior. But ultimately, it was not, beneficial at all to the people, to the government. Military diet. So this is a very strange observation that I got. So military diets were really inferior, even though they were fighting for the country. Their food, we can see a huge neglect in the ration that they were getting. Until 1844, a soldier was only served 2 meals a day, only breakfast and dinner. And again, it was mostly bread and gruel and meat occasionally. So we had the Crimean War, we all know about it. There was a severe food shortage, scurvy, sanitation failure, infections, and so on. So Florence Nightingale, the lady with lamp, believed that the main problems were diet, dirt, and drains. So she brought her team from England and cleaned up the kitchens, and she tried to standardize the diets of the soldiers in the Crimean War. So again, she was highly efficient at managing the sanitation, hygiene part, but she was not able to fully manage the kitchen. And there was huge mismanagement. And that time, Alexis Soyer, who is a French celebrity chef who had some prior experience of conducting mass feedings, he collaborated with Florence Nightingale, and he introduced field kitchens, fuel efficient stoves, and soldier cook training. So he conducted lot of training programs, and he wrote lot of cookbooks on how to prepare proper food for the soldiers. during wartime and also for the navies. And he also promoted preserved vegetables, preserved food, preserved meat for the soldiers, which can be eaten even during the war times. And post Crimean War to 1890s, the military rations were gradually standardized, like they were getting more quantities of bread, meat, tea, sugar, salt, and more of preserved or fresh vegetables when available. So, all thanks to again Alexis Sawyer, who really standardized and improvised the military diets. He also took lot of efforts to improve the naval diets. So again, the diets in the navy, those were monotonous, very inferior in quality, and long voyages used to worsen nutritional deficiency. So scurvy again was very common uh, in navy. And the typical ration of included ship biscuits. You can see one ship biscuit here. This is what they used to consume day and night, ship biscuits. And they also used to have salted meat, dried peas, cheese, butter, tea, sugar, alcohol. But mostly they had to depend on these biscuits. However, Alexis Sawyer tried to improve the naval rations, and tinned meat, preserved vegetables, condensed milk were introduced slowly. And so, in the initial time period, the diets were very monotonous. However, with time, it was more standardized and the quality was improved little bit. In Victorian England, they also were conducting lot of research on diet and nutrition, particularly Dr. Edward Smith. He did the first dietary surveys on the prisoners, on the working class people, workhouses, to understand their dietary intakes, nutritional requirements, and so on. He also conducted a lot of early experiments on energy expenditure and physical activity. Alexis Sawyer, he recorded army and naval dietary intakes, as I've already mentioned. And many new innovations were happening. For example, Alexis Sawyer developed that energy efficient stove for easy cooking in the fields. And then we have Sir Robert McCarrison. Again, we all know about him. He's also the founder director of our institute, National Institute of Nutrition, India. He studied the traditional and modern diets both in Britain and India. Although his work was mostly in the post Victorian time, but he retrospectively commented on the health benefits of the earlier diets, the traditional British diets with whole fruits, whole vegetables, whole grains, and the ill effects of these newly introduced processed and sugary products, which were responsible for the declining health of England. Also, domestic sciences were introduced. So, as educational opportunities for women and girls expanded in the Victorian and Edwardian periods, so what they were doing, they were linking household activities more and more with scientific subjects. So, for example, cookery with nutrition science, then child rearing with developmental psychology, home management with actual management discipline, hygiene with health sciences, and so on. So, domestic science was gradually introduced into the girls' school, and it became a part of every middle class girls' curriculum. Institutions like National Training School of Cookery, founded in 1873, formalized the subject. They also started degree programs in household sciences, and lot of books were being written. Especially, this is the famous book you can see, most widely sold book of household management, Mrs. Isabella Beaton's book of household management. We don't study it anymore in nutrition or home science, but yeah, at that point of time, they used to depend on this book. However, these domestic subjects reinforce patriarchal notions of women's home centeredness. So you can see one excerpt from the preface of Mrs. Beaton's book. Why should girls study home science or domestic science? She's explaining here. Men are now so well served out of doors at their clubs, well ordered taverns, and dining houses that in order to compete with the attractions of these places, a mistress must be thoroughly acquainted with the theory and practice of cookery, as well as be perfectly conversant with all the other arts of making and keeping a comfortable home. So we can understand how patriarchal notions were being reinforced through these domestic sciences. So this was the initial thought. However, further deeper analysis reveals that household work was not marginalized, not devalued. Rather, it was conceptualized as a scientific and intellectual activity which requires a proper training. So, definitely, they did not devalue household activities. Rather, they tried to train the women so that they can take more responsible positions. But again, it was domestic sciences were female dominated. Still, it is female dominated, and we can understand why people say that home sciences are for girls, not for boys. I get that a lot. But yes, the ideas come from Victorian England. So their focus on this happy domesticity and good housewife, these are the notions that were being reinforced by these domestic sciences. Overall, the domestic science schools played a crucial role in forming middle class female identity and legitimizing professional roles of women educators. So, coming to the summary, so we can understand again from this lecture that food security was improving from early Victorian period, where we had very low levels of food security and high levels of insecurity owing to the corn laws and hungry forties. And it gradually improved because food items became more available, more affordable, and import export became free, and communication, railway, navy became more and more stronger, which improved the food availability and food security. However, post Mid-Victorian period, during the late Victorian period and thereafter, nutrition security of the population started to decline, which is again attributed to the processed and sugary and high fat, high sugar, high salt products, HFSS products, what we call. Food gradually evolved into something more simple, convenient, and utilitarian. Unlike French, in France, the major focus was on refinement and precision. But for England, the major focus was on, the functional aspects, the convenience, simplicity of food. Food safety gained special importance. Food adulteration, food hygiene, and so on, safe handling practices. And unlike India, where still we do not consider these things, but yes, uh, late Victorian period onwards, it's a very important concern of the people of England, food safety and adulteration. Cooking was a feminine role in, at least in the domestic sphere. However, it was not devalued, rather, it was elevated to the status of a scientific discipline. And nutrition and dietetics finally evolved as a new scientific discipline from Victorian uh, period onwards. And in the post Victorian period, again, they'll go on, inventing and discovering lot of new concepts, and lot of dietary surveys will be there, which will ultimately help us understand the health and nutrition scenario of the country and how we can improve it. So these observations still has huge policy implications even in today's world. By understanding these trajectories, we can find out which are the products, which are the factors that led to the decline in nutrition security, and accordingly we can modify, we can learn from the past, and we can modify, we can improve our present decisions, our present policies. So that's all from my side. I'd like to acknowledge my long-term friend Neil Conto. He's an alumnus of Jadavpur University and a PhD scholar at Aiser Mohali for critically reviewing this lecture. And thank you so much. I'll be happy to take questions if any.
Thank you, Shonam, very much. Thank you for exploring and explicating the dynamics of nutrition in Victorian England. And this was a very balanced and very nuanced lecture which addressed so many different issues. I'm very sure that our audience would have questions for you. The floor is now open to the audience. If anyone has any question, they can directly ask Shonam. Darshan, are you trying to talk?
Hello, sir.
Yes, Darshan, you can directly ask your question to Shonam.
Sir, first of all, thank you for organizing such a thoughtful lecture.
Yes.
Sir, I am professor of English literature, and when I teach Victorian literature, and sometimes there are references about food security and food problems in the literature through of that. And as sir told about Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Sir, I want to ask. Uh, England was one of the greatest power in those days. But even then, there was a shortage of food, and there was a lack of nutritious food for the masses. So what was the reason behind that?
So as far as I get the question, like England was one of the most potent power seats in like in the Victorian age, and still there were nutritional deficiencies. So can you attribute any reason to those deficiencies?
Yes. So the power again, it was concentrated in the hands of elites. Their diets, if you look at the elite diets, it was highly diverse, rich in different food groups, and they were food secured, nutritionally secured throughout the period. All this is because of inequalities that they were having in their country, and yes, the policies that they were introducing, again, those were in the favor of the administrators, in the favor of those who have money, those who have power. So it's all about inequality that they face such kind of food related and nutrition related problems. These are particularly working class people's problem and poor people's problem.
Yeah, from the perspective of literature, like there were Shonam looked at the intersection of class and different attributes. So like there were rural populations who were into agriculture. There were like population who were into like industrial production, and they had their individual diets and they had their individual like deficiencies. If I'm correct, Shonam.
Yes. So when the rural poor, they still had a better dietary intake, especially when they started coming to the urban spaces. That time the conditions became worse.
Right. And also, like in the perspective of literature, there is a perspective and a representation of hunger. One thing, there was this difference between like the perception of hunger along the lines of gender. Like if like there was a pitiable hunger and there was a threatening hunger. Like the pitiable hunger was more from the perspective of children and women. If they're hungry, they might be perceived as like pitiable hunger, but like the voracious hunger of the Victorian men might or was represented as something threatening in Victorian literature. So this was also there in Victorian literature. But thank you for the question and thank you, Shonam, for the answer. If you have any other questions, you can directly ask Shonam.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Darshan. If there are any other questions, so while our audience still ponders on the question, I want to ask a few questions, like a couple of questions, not many. It was a very balanced and it was like an hour-long lecture. You must be very tired after this, but yeah. So since we're talking about like the nutritional or dietary transitions, uh, what about the differences in exports of food materials that were happening in Victorian England? Like, did the exports change? And attuned to the same question is that what kind of preservatives were they using in Victorian England, since they were like exporting food from other countries, mainly the colonies? So, were preservatives used in those cases?
So I'm not sure about the preservatives exactly what they were using, but definitely they were importing the packaged food products
Right.
from Latin American places and uh, from Australian countries and some other colonies areas, and their food processing technologies. That's what they were importing. And regarding export, I'm not again really sure about what all they were exporting because I didn't see much evidence of export from of different food items from Victorian England to other countries. Mostly they were importing these processed food items, and then when they imported the technologies, food processing technologies, they started producing it, and they were sending it to their colonies, and especially for their military and navies, they were sending it from England to other places.
Right, and there was an interesting observation that you drew in case of the army and the navy. They were getting like malnutrition diets in their
Yes.
in their like daily food. For like, thank you for the like. There are like many wonderful observations which were new to me as well, and I'm sure like as students of literature, we might be able to explore new angles into Victorian studies and understand the Victorian period in a bit more nuanced way. So you also mentioned this one thing like there was this Public Health Act, and it ensured that the availability of potable water. So like were there any other filtration processes that were like introduced in that age? Because since you also told that water was being drawn mainly from like river bodies, so were there any other new technologies that were getting involved in these filtration processes?
So they didn't have proper like modern filtration processes as such. The basic filtration, the screening and removal of mechanical screening related filtration that we have, that they were having. And when they transport water from the source to the, through pipe channels, that again increases the safety of the potable water, because while handling and other like carrying the water, the contact is limited, and therefore again it has an impact on the purity. So basically they were using mechanical basic screening techniques. Advanced filtration techniques they were not having at that time, and slowly they started developing.
Thank you very much, Onam. That's was like me from my side. If the audience has any question, they are free to
So
like.
basic
And
mechanisms were like, oh, okay, yes, yeah. So basic filtration mechanisms that they were using were sedimentation, mechanical screening, and removal of grits and other compounds. Uh, that's the thing. Yes, I think
Right.
somebody
Someone was
has.
asking a question. Yeah. Right.
So corpulence and eroticism are adjacent indulgences. So how did the regimentation of Victorian sexuality in Foucault, etc., sit alongside the dietary habits? The regimentation, the corseted, uh, sexual indulgences. How were they? How did they fit into the wider narrative of sensuality and sensual indulgence in Victorian England?
Well, I am not sure about it because I do not have a background in Victorian studies or this literature field. But can you just simplify the question regarding
Yeah.
like?
I will talk.
Because there is a wide discourse on Victorian sexuality that it was a repressed society, that India, also being a colony of England, inherited some of that. And so at the same time, there is a counterintuitive observation by Michel Foucault, who writes in his We the Other Victorians that in fact Victorian sexuality was rampant and it was a concupiscent society. So if you have seen like say uh, if you have seen movies, set in the famine era Ireland or India, so you would find that the central intelligences go side by side. So very often they sit alongside each other. They're adjacent intelligences. So how would this discourse, whether you go along with Foucault or not, this discourse on Victorian repressed sexual mores, so how do they find a resonance in dietary indulgences? Not exactly in terms of repression, but in terms of sensual enjoyment.
Well, if I talk about that, so food intake basically, I don't know how much it will be impacted by sensuality, food availability, accessibility, these things, but definitely enjoyment of sensualities. Probably, I'm not sure how much it will be the realities of the working class. Probably for elites, it may be a reality, but I don't have any evidence right now with me to comment on this.
We can definitely like think about that. We can like
Yes,
then address this question. But thank you for the question. It was a brilliant question. It is really a food for thought, like to go forward and like think along these lines. Thank you, Umar. Are there any other questions? So I guess that's it. Thank you, Shonam, for doing this. It was very
thank you
encouraging
so
for
much.
all of us for coming like from background of nutritional studies and engaging with us who who are essentially students of literature. So thank you very much, Shonam.
Even I got to know so many new things, and different perspectives are required for academic, a proper academic experience, enriching experience. So I'll be looking forward to more episodes like this, and I'll be joining definitely. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you,
And
Shonam. This evening was really a transdisciplinary evening on Victorian Sundays, and we will look forward to the audience's engagement in the next episode of Victorian Sundays. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Thank you very much. We will meet you once again in next week, next Sunday. Thank
thank
you.
you so much. Yes.